Welcome everyone. This is the first of two videos taking care of the greater part of the Bacon reading. So the next video, which is also on the website, is about taking you quickly through the text of the New Atlantis. Here I want to finish up the main reading and then say some things about a piece of text that I didn't assign. So if you in our last class, we were looking at this part of the Bacon reading, which is about the plan and structure of the Great Instauration. I went through and explained the various 6 divisions, and I said that each of these divisions corresponds to a book or a set of books that Bacon was intending to write as part of this great project of his, right? So each division has its own particular function. The first part is this book, which actually was written, which here he calls the Division of the Sciences. It was given a different title when he published it, and that laid out a kind of tree structure for for all knowledge. So it's kind of an organizational chart for all the sciences and how they fit and interconnected with one another. And under each science, interestingly, he took this as a chance to take stock not only of every science that existed, but to call for the creation of sciences that to that point did not yet exist. So instead of like simply trying to enrich the sciences as they now in his time existed, he tried to, from a much more general perspective, ask what sciences were needed. And if there was a science, if there was a certain aspect of human experience that hadn't been studied, then he created the title for a science that would fulfill it. Now, in its structure, of course, the way he understood knowledge, as we've seen, according to the inductive method, doesn't mean that science, as it will come to exist through that method, will look all that much different from the way traditional science had looked. Why? Because the inductive method is just the opposite way of tracing the same path as the deductive method. So, although the inductive method starts with particulars and experience, it moves towards general first principles, right? And the deductive method, as you'll recall, goes from general first principles to particular experiences. It's the same path, but you can go, as I said, both directions on that path. And where you start, of course, makes a huge difference as to what that path will look like and actually where it will lead, of course. But point being, the idea of having certain particular sciences that deal with particular experiences and ranges of experience, that was a normal idea even before Bacon. And having more general sciences like philosophy and metaphysics, that's also found in Bacon. He doesn't get rid of those things. He just sees them in a different relation to the other sciences. And the main idea is that whereas, say, in Aristotle, and we'll see in Descartes, philosophy must methodologically precede science and all particular sciences, for Bacon, particular sciences must precede and give the foundation for the more general sciences. So there's this opposite dependency, right? In the old way of thinking, the more particular sciences depended on the principles borrowed from the more general sciences. In Bacon's way of thinking, the more general sciences with more general principles generalize and thus depend upon the results reached in the particular sciences. So the second was the New Organon. This is the actual text that lays out the method of Bacon's entire work. So it focuses obviously on the inductive method. And as he uses this word interpretation, instead of anticipation, he contrasts anticipation to interpretation. When we anticipate nature, when we act like Aristotle and people who want to start from an idea of what nature must be like and then investigate nature according to that. We interpret nature when we let nature be as it is, and then we draw from that step by step, as he says, elicit more general principles or our science, right? The third was this, the phenomena of the universe. It's a description, a natural history towards laying the foundation of philosophy. So this is kind of an account of all the empirical, experimental, inductive knowledge we gain, and an ordering of it in a way that prepares the way for reaching the most general kinds of principles which are found in philosophy and metaphysics and so on. This process is also continued in this fourth work called The Ladder of the Intellect, the latter being from the particular to the more general. And then finally, in the fifth and sixth parts, he turns to the practical fruits of science, right? This is what he calls second philosophy, or practical science. And what does practical science or second philosophy do? Well, first of all, the title comes from the distinction between first philosophy. That's how the traditional philosophers talked about metaphysics, first philosophy, right? And everything else was second philosophy. Here, Bacon is using the idea of first philosophy for the first knowledge gained from induction, and second philosophy for the practical fruits and the practical application of that knowledge. So it's about arts. And then we started going through here, and I believe in one of my classes we got, this will be a slight repetition for some of you, but we got to about here, the second part of the work. So the first part of the work had to do with taking stock of the past. The second part of the work is what is that methodology, right, that is found in the book called The New Organon. Now, the New Organon was called the New Organon because Aristotle's book on methodology was called, not by Aristotle, but by people who followed Aristotle, that was called the Organon. An organ or an organon is, the meaning of that is a tool. So an instrument that you use, right? Your heart has a function of pumping your blood. In a certain way, you use your heart to pump the blood around your body. So that's the idea of an instrument or a tool, an organ or an organon. And so Bacon is calling for a new organon based not so much on deduction but on induction. So following his analogy or his metaphor of sailing and exploration, here Bacon, well, in the first part, when he talked about collecting information about the past and showing the structure, right, and laying out the divisions of science, he compared that to navigation, right? Navigation that is only going along the coasts of what already is known and puts it down in charts for the future. The new organon, by contrast, is not when you're setting out to chart what is already found, but setting up and gaining the equipment and understanding and experience needed to set out on the ocean itself, right? So not to go along the coast that is already known, but to set out in uncharted waters, right? So to pass through those gates of the Pillars of Hercules. So he says in the second part, an account of a better and more perfect use of reason in the investigation of things and of the true aids of the intellect, right? Now, he says this belongs broadly under the category of logic, but it is distinguished from all traditional logic, the logic of Aristotle, which used mainly relied on this logical tool called the syllogism, which is a kind of formal argumentation, right? And he says this new logic differs from ordinary logic in three particular ways. Three ways. In its end, in the order of demonstration, and in the starting point of its inquiry. By end, he means its goal. So what is the goal of this new science? He says, for the end we propose for our science is the discovery of arts, not of arguments, of principles and not of inferences from principles, of signs and indications of works and not probable reasonings. So let's go through those quickly. Arts, so practical fruits, that is the end. It's not knowledge for knowledge's sake. Knowledge is only useful insofar as it leads to production of things that help humanity, ultimately, and enrich humanity. Not of arguments, but of principles. And not of inferences from principles, but of signs and indications of works. When you're reading this, you have to, of course, sometimes in these things, it might be a little bit difficult to read. You have to supply something here. So, for the end we propose for our science is the discovery of arts, not of our arguments, of principles, but not of inferences from principles, of signs, but not, and indications of works, but not probable reasonings. So, principles and not inferences from principles. This might sound like, this might not make perfect sense initially when you think about it. What does he mean by principles? He's saying our goal is to discover the first principles. Well, didn't Aristotle aim to find the first principles? Doesn't Descartes aim, and he actually explains how to discover the first principles? How can that be different? Well, the point here is not that he wants to discover the first principles, but that he makes the discovery of first principles the focal point where all the work is to be done. So everyone has first principles. He's saying first principles are the hard work. They're not the thing that you look for, you find, and then go on to make a bunch of inferences. So in, say, Descartes, we'll see we very quickly find the first principles. That's the very beginning of the study. And from there, everything is about how you derive whatever other knowledge you want from those principles. So the main thing there is in the process of derivation. Here he's saying, because the main focus of the process is not in derivation or deduction, but rather in induction, induction aims at the principles. It makes the principles the topic of the investigation, not the basis for the investigation. So the end is the principles. So the end, remember, principles means beginnings. So for everyone else, the beginnings were the beginnings. That's why they were called principles in the first place. That's why they were given that name. But for him, principles are the end, the last thing, the thing towards which you work. Of signs and indications of works, so we look for, and our goal is signs and indications of works. It means, what is a sign and indication of works? It means when your scientific theories actually produce results, when you can actually make more healthy food, larger food, you can cure people, you can create technologies. Those are signs, indications. Those are the criteria for a good theory, that it has fruits. So our end is the signs and indications of works, not simply reasonings, right, that might or might not be true. And he says, different results follow from our different design. They defeat and conquer their adversary. They, not us, not our results. Don't be confused there. They, meaning the Aristotelians and other people, defeat and conquer their adversary by disputation, by arguing. We conquer nature by work. So there's two different points there. Previous people tried to conquer each other by argument. We're not concerned with defeating each other in arguments. We want to conquer nature, and we want to do so not by arguments, but by work. So twofold difference there. Now, he said the end, that was one of the three things, recall. The end, the order of demonstration. Next is the order of demonstrations. The nature and order of our demonstrations agree with such an end. So from the notion of what the true end of science should be, he's now going to say, well, how should our demonstrations work? Well, they should agree with that end. How so? For an ordinary logic, all effort is concentrated on the syllogism, on derivation, deduction, going from principles to the principled, or to the consequences. The logician seems scarcely to have thought about induction, going the other way. They pass by it with barely a mention and hurry on to their formulae for disputation, argumentation. But we reject proof by syllogism because it operates in confusion, because it doesn't have secure first principles, and lets nature slip out of our hands. Right? It lets nature slip out of our hands because it's too quick to come up with the ideas of what the fundamental principles of nature are without investigating them deeply enough. So nature is too subtle for our immediate understanding. But that's what we try to do when we deduce. We start with first principles that are supposed to be quick answers to what nature is at its deepest level. So he says we reject the syllogism, and not only for principles, as so far as principles are concerned, but also for intermediate propositions and other forms of propositions, right? So for the nature of things, we use induction throughout, and as much for the minor propositions as for the major ones. What does he mean here? What are these minor and major propositions? Well, the syllogism, a typical, kind of the cliche syllogism that people give is all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The idea there is all men, concept A, all men are C, mortal, right? All men are mortal. It connects the class of all men with the property or the predicate being mortal. And then it says Socrates, some individual thing, is a man. So falls under that all men. And therefore, so all A's are C, B, which is an individual man, Socrates, is A, therefore Socrates, being B, is now mortal, which was C, right? So all A's are C's, B is a C, therefore, no, all A's are C's, B is an A, therefore B is C. That's often called the syllogism of modus ponens. It's the name for it. Now, in that, all men are mortal is called the major proposition. Socrates is a man is called the minor proposition. And therefore, Socrates is mortal is the conclusion of the syllogism. So when he says here, we use induction for as much for the minor propositions as for the major ones, that's what he is referring to. So we don't only use induction to figure out what the what the general properties of general things are. All men are mortal. We use it even for investigating individual things and their properties, like Socrates. We use induction also for that. So we regard induction as the form of a demonstration which respects the senses, stays close to nature, fosters results, and is almost involved in them, meaning in the senses itself. So the order of demonstration here is completely reversed, right? We go from inductive experience to the first principles. We prove first principles through experiences. We don't prove particular experiences through first principles. It's the opposite way in terms of proof and demonstration. For the way things have been done normally until now is to leap immediately from sense and particulars to the most general propositions, as to the fixed poles around which any argument may revolve, then to derive everything else from them by means of intermediate propositions. By our method, axioms are gradually elicited step by step. The general things, the axioms, are brought out, and we move from the particular to the slightly more general to the slightly, step by step, degree by degree towards the most general. And now here he says it's not just that we use induction, but the biggest question that he wants to investigate is the actual form of induction. I said this in class a couple of times. Bacon's not claiming to have invented induction or an entirely new method, but to have given an entirely new form to an old method, right, and a new emphasis. The old induction proceeded, he says, by simple enumeration, which means by just repeated experiences. And for him, this is a childish thing that jumps to conclusions, right? One apple falls, two apples fall, all apples fall. This would be a terrible example of induction. You can reach many, many false conclusions by such a oversimplified, childish form of induction, right? I think I gave the example in class, one person comes into the room and has coins in their pocket. Second person comes to the room and has coins in their pocket. Third person comes into the room and has coins in their pocket. If you were then to come to the conclusion that, well, then all people who enter this room will have coins in their pocket, you're going to be quickly disappointed, right? That is the kind of childish, simple enumeration he's talking about. What would you do to be more clever? Well, you would not just gather more examples, but you might try different circumstances, different times of day, when different kinds of people were coming in. You would want to vary your experience as greatly as possible to try to falsify your general claim, right? You wouldn't simply repeat the same experience over and over again. So that's this idea about investigating the first principles more deeply is the emphasis of this next quite important paragraph. So he says, all of this is not all, for we place the foundations of the sciences deeper and lay them lower and set our starting point further back than men have ever done before, subjecting them, the first principles, to examination, while ordinary logic accepts them on the basis of others' belief. For logicians borrow the principles of the sciences from particular sciences themselves, then they pay respect to the first notions. For logicians borrow the principles of the sciences from the particular sciences themselves, then they pay respect to the first principles of the mind, and finally they are happy with the immediate perceptions of healthy senses. But our position is that true logic should enter the province of the individual sciences with greater authority than is in their own principles, and compel those supposed principles themselves to give an account as to what extent they are firmly established. So what he's referring to here is in the traditional Aristotelian and other understanding of science, sciences accept their first principles from elsewhere, right? And those who practice the logic of that science, they make arguments, say physical arguments in physics. They lay down the principles of physics and they accept those from metaphysics or from another science. For instance, the mathematician talks about number, but the mathematician doesn't investigate the concept of number. The concept of number is, if anywhere, investigated in metaphysics, right? Where Aristotle, for instance, in his metaphysics talks about what unity and number are. And he lays out what number are in a different science. The mathematician simply uses number and presupposes his own first principles or her own first principles in carrying out the science. Now Bacon's saying that's all wrong. The sciences should be investigating their own first principles. They should be scrutinizing and putting to the question the basic principles of their own sciences. And that is an absolutely, today you say, well, of course physicists ask about the basic principles of physics. What else would they do? Well, that is not what they did traditionally. Those first principles were figured out in philosophy and other places, and then applied and used in physics to explain. Physics was involved in explaining physical processes by reference to accepted first principles. It's only as the result of Bacon, and it is Bacon's idea here, that physicists should be putting into question their own first principles. So here he says the induction, the method, should be in the individual sciences, and it should have more authority than their own principles, and compel those principles, those supposed principles, to give an account as to what extent they are firmly established. As for the first notions of the intellect, not one of these things which the intellect has accumulated by itself escapes our suspicion. So we saw earlier, for Bacon, to be a good scientist, you have to be kind of a jerk. You have to disrespect the authorities, but you also have to be suspicious. You have to be suspicious that things might not be true that seem true. In a certain sense, the more obviously true, the more you should probably be suspect of it. That's good academic advice in any case. Most people are not, right? Most people assume that if most people believe it's true, it's probably true. If you read it in a book, it's probably true. You read it on Wikipedia, it's probably true. Bacon is saying the critical mind, if you want to have a critical mind, as soon as something is accepted by everyone, you should be suspicious. Because, and this is one of his lessons, that one of the reasons the reason that so many people quickly accept something is usually not that it's true, but that it conforms to our prejudices and our preconceptions. And because we cannot totally escape our own preconceptions and prejudices, when something just seems naturally to be the case, particularly about nature, but in general, that's when your suspicion should arise, right? That should make it suspicious by itself. And we do not confirm them without submitting them to a new trial, the first notions, and a verdict given in accordance with it. Furthermore, we have many ways of scrutinizing the information of the senses themselves. And here's a key point that is often not noticed or at least underestimated, which although Bacon is often called an empiricist, and we've seen what's dangerous about the use of that term, still, no matter what, he is put in line with a lot of people who believe that the fundamental foundation, of course, of science is sense experience. He themselves, and you say this is in line with his suspicion before, he says the senses often deceive us. They are not the key. The key is not simply do lots of experiments and perceive lots of things and don't let your mind generalize too quickly. The senses themselves also are terribly deceptive. In fact, he says somewhere here that the senses are even more deceptive than the mind. So why follow the senses? Well, Descartes will argue that the senses are the source of deception and error as well. But he thinks the mind corrects the senses, and it's the inner scrutiny of the mind itself that is the key to truth. Bacon says the inner self is tinged with all of these prejudices, so the mind cannot correct the senses, and the senses can't correct the mind by themselves because the senses too are deceptive. The key is in the integration of the two, in not just in perceiving the world, but in carrying out well-designed experiments, right? So we have to, why are the senses important for Bacon? Because the senses are closer to reality than our minds are. The senses actually perceive something really there, but they distort what is there, and this means truth and knowledge can only come from the critical correction of sense experience. We can't get it through the mind alone, as Descartes would have, and we can't get it through the senses alone, but we can get it from the senses if that sense experience is critically evaluated according to a method. So he says, for the senses often deceive, but they also give evidence of their own errors. However, the errors are to hand, the evidence is far to seek. The senses are deceptive in two ways. They fail us altogether, or they may deceive. So he says here, they may fail us altogether. The senses don't allow us to see like atoms and the smallest parts of bodies. I don't know if he believed in atoms or not, but he does talk about there are obviously things too small, too far away, and so on to be seen by the senses. The senses deceive us by not giving us information about most of the world. On the other hand, the things that we do see, they often deceive us. If you put a stick in a glass of water, it will look broken, but it's not. Rainbows look like they're out there in the sky, but they are not. The senses, there are all kinds of illusions of the senses. And this is the reason. This is the underlying reason, or the way he understands the deception of the senses. He says, the evidence and information given by the senses is always based on the analogy of man, not of the universe. What that means is, this is essentially the same idea he puts in another place by saying that human nature is like a mirror. A mirror that is bent in a certain way. So that when you look in the mirror, at what it reflects, the universe around us, we see more that has to do with the distorting power of the mirror than about the universe itself. Or here he's saying, when you taste something, you are learning more about your tongue than you are about the food that you are tasting, right? The only way that the tongue tells us anything about foods and their actual objective chemical compositions is insofar as we've studied the structure of the tongue, and we know that, for instance, that sweetness is caused by certain chemical substances. And we've studied the tongue, and we've noticed that you can induce that reaction in other ways. You can be deceived. Something may taste like it has sugar in it, but it doesn't have sugar in it. It has some kind of other artificial sweetener. We can deceive your tongue, and it doesn't give any precise information, except if that information is put through a theory, a scientific theory about the structure and function of the tongue, which is derived from the rest of physiology and chemistry and so on. So, in other words, it says the evidence and information that the senses give is kind of colored by, it's on the analogy of man, not on the universe. Now, in this next part, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's interesting to find out. You say here, how do we solve this problem of the senses? I said it's through careful experimentation and so on. And you might say, well, wouldn't the best way to solve the problems of the senses is to invent instruments, telescopes, microscopes, things like this? And what's interesting about this next is he says it's not so much the case. We do this not so much with instruments. He didn't have a great belief in the use of instrumentation in science. He thought they were useful, but not really that important. He says not so much with instruments as with experiments. For the subtlety of experiments is far greater than the senses themselves, even when assisted by carefully designed instruments. We speak of, and you can think why this might be, the instruments that were used in his period were very rudimentary. And they didn't even understand how these instruments worked particularly well. They had telescopes and microscopes and things, and there was not a good understanding of even how those functioned. We speak of experiments which have been devised and applied specifically for the question under investigation with skill and good technique. And therefore, we do not rely very much on the immediate and proper perception on the senses, but we bring the matter to the point that the senses judge only the experiment judges the thing. Very important quotation. You should definitely mark that in your text. So, what do the senses do? Well, you're in the laboratory. You don't actually use your senses as your main instrument. The experiments are the main instruments. But your perceptions or senses are used to judge the experiments. So what do I mean by this? Well, you read the thermometer when you put it in a test tube, right? You put water in a test tube and you boil it with a thermometer, and you notice that when it hits the boiling point, it begins to boil, and the temperature rises until it hits the boiling point, and then once it starts boiling, it stays at that temperature, right? And you say, I see that it's boiling. I see the measurement on the thermometer. I'm using my senses, but I'm not using them to determine the truth in this circumstance. I'm using it just to read the instrumentation. It's the experiment that shows me what is true and what is false, right? I just have to use, of course, the senses. The experiment is what judges the truth or the thing. The senses inform me about the experiment. Now, he's still talking about his methodology, right? And he says, to do all of this, to lay the foundations more deeply, to follow induction and so on, we need, and this is a key point I haven't said so much about at this point, is that we need to study the form of induction, and we need to design induction around an understanding of the kinds of prejudices that human beings have. These prejudices are what Bacon refers to as the four idols, right? So the idols are like the inherent curvature of the human mirror. And to decipher what's in the mirror, we have to study that curvature precisely and design our method around that or to counter that, right? So here are he begins talking about the idols here. He says, these idols are of two kinds. The mind is occupied by idols. These are either artificial or innate. So artificial means they're man-made. We make them ourselves. We weren't born with these idols, some of them. Other ones are innate, in our nature, such that we can't get rid of them without getting rid of our minds themselves. So some of them we can more or less rid ourselves of with practice. Others we have to constantly correct for. No matter what we do, they'll always be there and always need to be fought. So the artificial idols have entered men's minds either from doctrines. So this is like false ideas we get from the past and sects of philosophers, or from perverse rules of proof, the use of the syllogism, and so on. So these are like things that have been created, specific theories and methods that have been handed down and are not good. That's one sort of idol. The innate idols are inherent in the nature of the intellect itself. As I said, they're part of our nature, part of our intellect, which is found to be much more prone to error than the senses. The first two kinds of idols can be eliminated with some difficulty, but the last in no way. The only strategy remaining on the one hand is to indict them and to expose and condemn the mind's insidious force in case after the destruction of the old, new shoots of error should grow and multiply from the poor structure of the mind itself. And the result would be that errors would not be quashed, but simply altered. Right? And this is the study of the idols is the second part of the work. Now, after we've set out on the sea, right? Remember, he charted the waters, so the known waters. He devised the instruments for going out on the broad sea. That was just done. We plan not only to show the way and build the roads, but also to enter upon them. Now he switches his metaphor to roads from ships. And therefore he's going to collect, so this is actually carrying out what he was saying. He's going to collect the phenomena of the universe and lay down and establish the foundations for philosophy. Here's another statement of how the senses themselves are defective and deceiving. They're lazy, uneven, and casual, and so on and so forth. It's just another confirming quote. I think the rest of this you've read, nothing too important that I need to comment on. Here you can read this part. It's just a very good summary of how the attitude that a scientist should have, following all of what we've said before. It says, for we use the evidence of our own eyes, or at least our own perception in everything, and apply the strictest criteria in accepting things, so that we exaggerate nothing in our reports for the sake of sensation, not sensation as senses, but in terms of popularity or causing a sensation, as we say. And our narrations are free and untouched by fable and foolishness. This is, good advice on how you write a research report in the sciences, right? You don't exaggerate. You don't fill it with fable and foolishness and myths and stories, which is what was done at the time. We also specifically proscribe and condemn many widely accepted falsehoods so that they may not trouble the sciences anymore. For as someone wisely remarked, that the stories and superstitions and trifles which nurses instill in children also seriously deprave their minds. By the same reasoning, we feel that we must be careful and even anxious that philosophy should not at the start get into the habit of any kind of foolishness as we foster and nurture its infancy in the form of natural history. So what is he referring to? Well, one of the persistent features of he said we need to collect information about the past. That was done. This guy named Pliny, who was an Aristotelian and a Roman philosopher and natural historian, he collected lots of stuff. And if you go back into the medieval period, there were lots of books that collected information about the world. But if you read those things, they are rather interesting because they talk about, they're full of myths and full of stories that people have heard, because that's very interesting. That's much more interesting than finding, oh, I found this exotic fish. You say, I found men who lived in Africa whose skin was pitch black, who didn't speak, and who had gills and could swim under the water without breathing, right? These kinds of things were in these books. Like big stories. You probably are aware of this, when Columbus and others came back from the New World, and when people went to China and so on, they would bring back these tall tales of cultures that actually did not exist and never have existed, right? Of exotic peoples and animals and all kinds of things. And he's saying this kind of thing needs to be avoided. It's not about selling books. When we collect natural history and write it down, we should try to be as dispassionate and objective as possible. So we cast away and banish every kind of fantasy. Finally, since we have now such experience in history, since we have seen how such experience in history distort the sight of the human mind and how difficult it is at first to get used to nature, we often add our own observations, which are like the first turn or move of history towards philosophy. So he's saying, usually when we write these natural histories, we ourselves try to give theories to explain them without properly undertaking the method, and so we tend to distort those stories that we tell. It says here, after we have done all this and we've got all the aides and bodyguards and we have built a fine army of divine works, it may seem nothing to remain but to approach philosophy itself, right, towards those general principles. This, of course, this building of a true, complete philosophy out of all our knowledge and a complete science of first principles. Here he says it is beyond our ability and beyond our expectation to achieve this final part and bring it to completion. So it's the end. It's something we may never achieve. But we don't need to, because what we need to achieve are the producing of works and fruits. In this process, he says, finally, it is not merely human success in speculation, in knowledge, which is in question, but the human situation, human fortune, and the whole potential of works. For man is nature's agent and interpreter. He does and understands only as much as he has observed of the order of nature, in work or by inference. He does not know and cannot do more. No strength exists that can interrupt or break the chain of causes. Nature does what it does. We cannot change that. And nature is conquered only by obedience. Therefore, those two goals of man, knowledge and power, a pair of twins, are really come to the same thing, and works are chiefly frustrated by ignorance of causes. This is this famous claim of Bacon, knowledge and power really come to the same thing. The more you know, the more you can do. But this also has the side, as he's emphasizing here, if you want to do anything, you have to know. This is this idea, nature is conquered, that's the power, only by obedience, the knowing. When you know something, when you know nature, you do it by observing it, by attending to it, by, in a word, obeying it, right? Showing respect to nature. At least insofar as knowledge is concerned, right? That's how you gain knowledge. By respecting, you shouldn't respect other philosophers and people who came, scientists. You should respect nature and always expect it is outsmarting you. Always be suspicious that your theories are true and so on. And it's, yes. Okay. So I said I would say a little bit about the New Organon here. This is some parts of the, you'll see there's repetition here a little bit of what I've already said. But for instance, here in 3, it says human knowledge and human power come to the same thing, because ignorance of cause frustrates effect. For nature is conquered only by obedience, and that which is thought is a cause is a rule in practice. Here he extends it a little bit. But notice he's just repeated something I just said before, what we just read in the text. That's how these aphorisms work. You're supposed to read them and compare them with one another and slowly gather a better and better sense of what he is talking about. Notice here he adds a little bit to what he said before. He says, and that which is thought is a cause is like a rule in practice. Just saying, if you know causes, if you know that a certain molecule causes the blood pressure in a human being to decrease, knowledge of that cause can be transformed into a rule of practice. Meaning, if you have high blood pressure, then consume this chemical, right? So knowledge of the cause leads to a rule of practice. Knowledge is equal to, and it comes to the same thing as power, the ability to do things. I will skip most of these. As I go through here, though, as I'm flipping through, you might want to mark the ones that I've highlighted here, because these might be useful to read, to maybe fill out and clarify some things for yourself. So I am going to kind of more slowly scroll through here. Here, when we get to some, I will talk about them. So we talked about those 4 idols, and this is mainly why I want to look at the new organon briefly, is because he goes into some detail about these idols. There are 4 idols. The 4 idols are each given a special name. Remember, there were some idols that were artificial and some that were innate. The 4 idols, we'll see which of those are and what they consist of, and then I'll bring this video to a close. The 4 idols are the idols of the tribe, like a group of people. You know, I know today we use this only to talk about, tribesmen or people living in isolated cultures, maybe in the rainforest or something. But generally, tribe just means any group of people that is bound together by a society and maybe ethnically. The idols of the cave. 3rd, the idols of the marketplace. And 4th, the idols of the theater. Well, what are those? The idols of the tribe are founded in human nature itself and in the very tribe of our human race. So clearly, whatever the idols of the tribe are, they are innate. They're in human nature itself and in the very tribe of the human race. So by the tribe, he doesn't mean a specific group. He means the tribe of humans, the human race itself. These idols, these prejudices, another word for the idols, this one is founded. This encompasses all the idols. The idol of the tribe encompasses all the idols that are founded in our very nature as human beings. So the assertion that the human senses are the measure of things is false. So one of the idols is the belief that the senses are not deceptive, that the senses give us truth. That's one of the idols that is in our human nature. You've probably all heard the phrase, seeing is believing, right? That's not really true, is it? I see a rainbow in the sky. Maybe I believe it, but I shouldn't. If I believe everything that I see, then I would be greatly misled in many, many cases. The assertion that the human senses are the measure of things is false. To the contrary, all perceptions, both of sense and mind, are relative to man, not to the universe. Again, we've seen this. He said analogous to man, not to the universe before. The human understanding is like an uneven mirror receiving rays from things and merging its own nature with the nature of things, which thus distort and corrupts it. So that's the idol of the tribe. The idol of the cave, the idols of the cave, notice it's idols. It's not one. As I said, this is the group of, he mentions one here about the senses, but then also the mind, anything else that is founded in our human nature. Even ways of thinking, like confirmation bias, would fit under idols of the tribe, perhaps. Idols of the cave are illusions of the individual man. Right? So these have to do with, these two are innate, but they're innate not in us as human beings, but as individuals. So what is he talking about here? Well, I might be such a person that I like general theories. I'm just very good at making general theories, connections between things. I'm a theoretical mind, maybe, there are lots of physicists like this, someone like Einstein, only attracted to the big ideas, has no patience. Well, I was a physics major and I was attracted to big theories. scientific ideas that were very close to philosophy, as it ends up. Carrying out careful experiments, writing up lab reports. I did not like that. There were people who liked that, people who specialized in that. We had different minds. And this has an effect on the things that we think and do in science, right? I would naturally look for a general solution to a problem. I would try to solve my problem through mathematics and those kinds of methods. Whereas someone else would try to solve the problem in a different way and would propose different kinds of hypotheses because they have a different bent to the way they think. This is what the kind of thing that Bacon considers under Idols of the Cave. So the cave is your own private self. So for each man has a kind of individual cave or cavern which fragments and distorts the light of nature. This may happen either because of a unique and particular nature of each man, or because of his upbringing and the company he keeps, or because of his reading of books and the authority of those whom he respects and admires, or because the different impressions things make on different minds, preoccupied and prejudiced perhaps, or calm and detached, and so on. It's about someone might be prejudiced and preoccupied, others are calm and detached, right? It's our own individual characters. Yet the evident consequence is that the human spirit is a variable thing, quite irregular, almost haphazard. Right? Nice quote from Heraclitus, who was a pre-Socratic ancient philosopher. He said, Heraclitus well said that men seek knowledge in lesser private worlds, not in the great common world. The third, so those two are innate in our natures and cannot be ever fully removed from us. The third one is called the idols of the marketplace. These are, he says, these arise by agreement and from men's association with each other. Why is it called the idols of the marketplace? Well, as we'll see, this idol has a lot to do with language. A lot of philosophers at the time found that one of the big reasons probably that science didn't progress was because the language used by scientists was not designed for science. It was designed for other purposes, mainly for communication and for association and for economic exchange and so on. Languages were created to communicate. That was the function. And the better they could communicate, the more they were used, and the worse they could be used to communicate, the worse they were. None of that had to do with forming a language so as to express truth. In fact, a language that's better able to express truth might be a worse language to communicate with. So for instance, we have now, since Bacon, created vast quantities of language simply for the purpose of science. If you look at the periodic table and you look at all those symbols on the periodic table, that is an artificially constructed language of symbols. That was made uniform. Why does everyone use the same symbol? Why is PB for lead all over the world? Although it's not related to the English word, it's related to the Latin word for lead. So that, because that is the best way, not to communicate, that is not really the purpose. It's the best way to communicate truth, not simply to communicate. It would be better if you use PB in your everyday life. Most people won't understand what you're talking about. Right? If I need a piece of lead, I'm doing a craft project or something, and I need a sheet of lead or some kind of lead, and I go around telling people I need PB, they wouldn't know what I'm talking about. And I say, oh, well, that's the symbol for lead, right? It's better if I just say the word lead. But if I'm talking with chemists, they're all going to use that symbolism because they're concerned to be precise in everything they do. If you read chemistry textbooks or chemistry things from Bacon and just after Bacon, acids were used words like vitriol. What does the word vitriol mean? It means angry. So these were like, acids the language for them was like angry liquids, right? And they had vitriol of ammonia and vitriol of, so they had, the liquid was a vitriol. It means it was some kind of corrosive substance. and then usually the rest of the title for it came from where they got it or was in that way. Mercury was called Quicksilver because it looked like silver and it moved and flowed. Right? This is not very useful for writing scientific textbooks, and this is why we created other languages. We created a whole language about how to name animals that people do not use. If you would go around and call your dogs always by, their specific Latin species and so on names, or any other animals, people aren't going to know what you're talking about. Except that is the only way in science to really make progress, is by having created these languages. Even mathematical symbolism is such a created artificial language. But all of these things were invented in this period in an attempt to solve what Bacon here calls the idol of the marketplace. Now, why is it called the marketplace? Because the marketplace is symbolically the place of association and exchange with other human beings. And this was actually true that languages sprung up around places where there were markets, like harbors, great places where, like Leipzig or London or other places where you had exchange, or where you had ships coming from all over the world. Those harbors and those places were generally where people from all over the world, speaking all kinds of different languages, came together to exchange. And what do? Well, they don't speak each other's language, so they create not a good language to express truth, but a language that is just there so that they can get their work done. Let me give an example. I used to live in Egypt, and you'd go to the market, right, the marketplace, and I wanted to buy some lemons, right? And I point to the thing and I say lemon, and he doesn't know what I'm saying. Am I saying lemon? Am I referring to the fruit? He doesn't know in English, so he doesn't know if I'm saying how much I want in another language. It's not knowing whether I'm asking how much they cost. Doesn't know anything. And he looks at them and he says, points, and he goes, orange, orange, orange. And I think for a moment to myself, and I think, well, no, those are lemons. But I don't continue going lemon because I don't care whether this man in the marketplace is using the right word for the fruit or not. It doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that I get those fruits in my basket, I pay for them, and I take them home and eat them. So I look at the person and I point and I say, yes, oranges, orange, orange. He says, okay, orange, right? And we go along, and from now on, when I go to the market, I don't even think about the fact that when I look at the lemons and I want lemons, I look at the same man, I look at those things and say, I want some oranges, right? This is how it works. This is how everyday life works. We suit our language to the role and function of communicating with one another. We are not concerned primarily with whether it corresponds to the truth. And this leads Bacon to think that language itself has a corrupting influence on our concern to communicate in the marketplace as a kind of symbolically corrupts our language, but then our language, once it's corrupted, makes it almost impossible to record truths about nature correctly. And so it has an impact back on science and corrupts our knowledge. So that's the idea here. So he says, men associate through talk, and words are chosen to suit the understanding of the common people. And thus a poor and unskilled code of words incredibly obstructs the understanding. The definitions and explanations with which learned men have become accustomed to protect in some way, and in some way liberate themselves, do not restore the situation at all. Plainly, words do violence to the understanding and confuse everything. And betray men into countless empty disputations and fictions. So many of the arguments in sciences end up springing up not because of anything that's really being disputed about the truth, but rather because two people are using the same word in different ways or something. It's what's called a logomachy, right? A word battle instead of a battle about truths and things. Finally, the fourth idol, and of course we can, by creating a new language, we can more or less rid ourselves of this. finally, the fourth one is the idols of the theater. And this one's not very interesting, but the reason he calls it the theater is kind of where people would get, it would be the place like your television or whatever, wherever your computer, wherever you get your information. And there is a kind of belief in what we are presented with, right? We adopt that kind of without being critical. And that's what he's talking about. We adopt philosophies as if they were plays being displayed for us. Aristotle's theory is like a nice story that we learn, and that corrupts our understanding of the world. Of course, that's something we can get rid of. And of course, just as the best play, the most entertaining, the thing that makes us feel the best at the theater is the one that becomes the most popular, so also, if the way we look for truth is by looking at the philosophies that we're presented with, well, those are only the most popular ones. Those are the ones that have survived. And those have probably survived because they please and suit our prejudices, not because they are true themselves. So the idol of the theater is when we adopt the popularly praised fictitious worlds, right? So he's saying Aristotle's theory is like a fictitious story, just like the plays put on in a theater. Okay, and there are more, so I'm going to he goes more deeply into each of these and talks about confirmation bias and so on in some of these. But what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to slowly scroll through so you can see on here the number that and where I've highlighted things, so you can go through and look at those yourself. But essentially I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to bring this video to a close. So let me take you on this journey. Here we go. Again, more on the idols of the marketplace. Here he criticizes empiricism, or the empirical brand of philosophy. He explains exactly what's wrong with it. There's one here I should draw a lot of attention to. This one. Definitely each of you go and read this one, because here he brings together the idea of rationalists, empiricists, and he criticizes both of them, and he compares empiricists are like ants, they just accumulate things. Rationalists are like spiders that spin webs from themselves. And he compares his own way to the way of the bee, he says, right? It takes the material and it not only collects it, but it integrates it, right? It creates, says, the way of the bee is between the ant, as the empiricist, and the spiders, the rationalists. It takes material from the flowers of the garden and fields, but it has the ability to convert it and digest it. The digestion is that process of the methodological experimentation and so on. This is not unlike the way the true working of philosophy, which does not rely solely on or mainly on mental power, and does not store the material provided by natural history and experiments in its memory untouched or unaltered, but altered and adapted in the intellect. Right? Therefore, much is to be hoped for from a closer and more binding alliance, combination between experiment and rational argumentation. So his is a path in between. Let's see, this one. And that is the end. All right, thank you for your attention.